Okay, so welcome to everyone. My name is Henry Luce. This is the Zoom webinar from the theory from the margins, entitled Gender and the Margins, with our very special guest, Columbia University professor Lila Abu-Lughod, with us from New York. What I'll do is I'll say a little bit about the theory from the margins research collective. We have, as a matter of fact, a new member of the collective to introduce to our audience today in the form of Dr. Sridhar Sircar, who replaces Momita Sen. A few words about Sircar. She is a lecturer in India and Global Affairs at King's India Institute at King's College in London, an urban geographer and a contributing writer for feminism in India. So we're very pleased to welcome also Srilata to Theory from the Margins. I'm Sindre Bangstad, a research professor at KIFO, the Institute for Church, Religion and Worldview Research in Oslo, Norway, and with me is also Theory from the Margins members Kristin Suraya Batman-Jelici and Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, both from the University of Oslo, but Suraya is with us from Detroit in the US. So before we start, a few words about the format for these Theory from the Margins Zoom webinars. I will provide a very brief introduction to today's distinguished guest, Professor Lila Abu-Lughod. She will then be speaking for 15 to 20 minutes before we proceed to questions from the panelists. We will then open the floor for pre-moderated questions from you to Professor Abu-Lughod. These will have to be submitted via chat, so please feel free to pose questions via chat as we go along. There's no guarantee given the numbers that we'll able to read out your question in particular, but we'll do our best to fit in as many questions as we can. So by way of introduction, Professor Lila Abu-Lughod is a scholar about whom it may truly be said that she requires no introduction. She is the Joseph L. Buttenwieser Professor of Social Science at the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University in New York. Lila is a Palestinian American anthropologist who has, over the course of an anthropological career now spanning well over 40 years, made seminal contributions to the anthropology of the Middle East, to feminist anthropology, to the so-called anthropology of Islam, and to the anthropology of the media. For her PhD from Harvard University in 1984, she undertook years of ethnographic research on the Bedouin Awlad Ali in the borderlands between Egypt and Libya. Published as the monograph Veiled Sentiments, Honor and Poetry in a Bedouin Society by the University of California Press in 1986, and republished by the same publisher in a 30-year anniversary edition in 2016, it is indisputably a classic of modern anthropological literature. Among other monographs, we find her 1993 University of California Press Writing Women's Worlds, Bedouin Stories, her 2004 University of Chicago Press Dramas of Nationhood, The Politics of Television in Egypt, her 2007 co-authored Nakba, Palestine, 1948, and The Claims of Memory with Ahmed H. Saadi, and her 2013 Do Muslim Women Need Saving from Harvard University Press. She has also delivered the Lewis Henry Morgan Lectures at Rochester University back in 2001. These lectures are considered arguably the most distinguished lectures to be invited to give in anthropology at large. In today's Theory from the Margins Zoom webinar, Lila will be speaking about gender and the margins and about her forthcoming co-edited volume with Rima Hamami and Nadira Shabub-Kevorkian entitled The Cunning of Gender Violence. So on behalf of the Theory from the Margins Collective, let me simply say that we are truly honored and thrilled to have you with us, Lila. And over to you.
Thank you, Sindra, for this overgenerous introduction, to all of you for the honor of this invitation to be part of what's quite an incredible series and in conversation with you. And I have to say, for the media blitz you did to make available so many of my previous writings so that we could inform this amazing international audience that you always get for this series. As I thought you might be missing the Americans since it's so early in the morning here for a webinar, but maybe it's time that the US was put in its proper place at the margins. So I have to preface my remarks by saying that I feel awkward appearing alone in this webinar, since I'm representing and will be presenting a project that's been truly collective and collaborative. And the project I'll be talking about, as you mentioned, and soon we hope to be a book, called The Cunning of Gender Violence, Feminism and Geopolitics. It's taken over my life for the last 3 or 4 years and transformed the kind of work that I'd been used to doing as an anthropologist of the everyday in the Arab and Muslim world. Sort of exploded my universe. It expanded my political vision. And apropos of this series, what I think we've actually been doing is working at the margins of theory from the margins, because we're working at the margins of feminist theory, which itself is at the margins. But none of this could have been done alone, and I'm indebted to the really brilliant critical feminist scholars we brought together in conversation around this project. And the 2 colleagues who entrusted me with presenting our collective work today are Rima Hamami from Birzeit University and Nadira Shabub-Kevorkian from Queen Mary Law School and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. We thought and we wrote collaboratively. Whose ideas are whose? Whose sentences are whose? We actually no longer know. And I began to think, is that a model for theory at the margins? No individual heroes, a political and ethical project that has to be collective. So they were my constant companions in thought as we organized workshops in New York and Amman, and as our hope for a meeting in South Asia was stymied by passports and visas and security concerns. They were there as we learned from our colleagues about gender violence, about the exploitation of feminist ideas in dangerously violent geopolitics, and about what the feminist agenda to call out gender violence was actually doing in various locations where we worked, from Bangladesh to India, Iran to Palestine, Tanzania to Jordan, the White House to the UN, and even the International Criminal Court. It was they, Rima and Nadira, who had much more background than I did, and actually many of our participants in the group, than I did on the politics of gender violence and the exported technologies that enforce the anti-GBV agenda. It was Rima and Nadira who inspired the proposal that we submitted to the Henry Luce Foundation, and we called our project Religion and the Global Framing of Gender Violence. And that the amazing Dr. Toby Volkman, who's headed this visionary initiative on religion and international affairs for a decade, believed in and supported. So we're very grateful to her, as we are to the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia and Columbia's Global Center in Amman, who all contributed to making our work possible. Now, as Sindra described, I come out of anthropology. Sure, I'd already developed suspicions about the seductions of the honor crime for stigmatizing Muslims, because I had such a different understanding of the workings of the moral code that included honor from my fieldwork in Egypt. And yes, I've been suspicious of the rhetoric being used to justify foreign military intervention in Afghanistan in the name of saving oppressed Muslim women, because of my years of intimate living with communities of women in different parts of the Middle East. But I was to learn so much more from them and those we brought together about the feminist politics around gender violence. Now, when I come in a few minutes to read a selection from our introduction to the book for you, just to give you a sense of the book that we pulled together, I want you to remember that these are our words that have been built out of the ideas and words of all those we worked with. And I'd love to give a shout out to all the scholars and journalists and critical legal scholars and anthropologists and activists and students who were part of this project over the years, but that would take up all our time. So I just wanted to mention those whose essays, besides our three, you'll be able to read when their book comes out. And that includes Janet Jacobson, Letty Volpe, Vasuki Nisaya, Rafia Zakaria, Inderpal Gruel, Shanila Khoja Mulji, Shahla Talabi, Samira Shackle, Dina Siddiqui, Seema Shaksari, and Nina Berman. All great essays. So now let me tell you a bit about the argument of the book. And here's how we set up the problem in our introduction. Over the course of 2 decades, violence against women, VOW, and subsequently gender-based violence, GBV, have emerged as powerful agendas within international governance and law, increasingly folded into state sovereignty and global security. What were once marginalized feminist concerns about the gravity of gender violence and the terrible silence that surrounded it now sit firmly in the nexus of powerful global networks of institutions and practices that have recast governmentality, development, humanitarianism, and even human rights in line with post 9/11 global security regimes. How did this happen? What are the politics, ideologies, and geographies of this feminist agenda? What are the modes and channels of operation of the master category, which we're now calling GB-VOW, as both a technology and an apparatus of rule? And most urgently for feminists, what effect is this having on those who are the subjects of violence as they experience it inscribed on their bodies, lives, and relationships, whether made hyper-visible or deliberately unseen? Has the conviction about the urgency of addressing violence against women and other forms of gender-based violence translated into better lives for women and humanity more generally? These are key questions for our times and ones that lie at the heart of our book. So The Cunning of Gender Violence explores the dynamic political and institutional circuits that VOW, succeeded by GBV, and sexual GBV inhabit, traverse, consolidate, and animate. That's the way we think about it. It traces the silences and omissions of these categories, and it exposes through very carefully, beautifully researched studies how the prevailing assumptions of GB-VOW serve to affirm, enable, or sustain salient rationales and systems of power. And the Middle East and South Asia, which is our regions in this collective, I guess, as well. The regions on which we've focused are actually crucial analytical sites for developing this understanding because of the ways that religion and racialized ethnicity, particularly the Muslim question, run so deeply through the international governance structures of GB-VOW, even as they're insistently disavowed. Activists who continue to see the embedding of GB-VOW in global governance as a feminist gain regularly caution, actually, against racialization and Islamophobia, but they usually dismiss them as uncomfortable baggage that burdens or even hijacks the good work of combating violence. Yet the ethnographic cases that we present in the book, as well as the analyses of the workings of GB-VOW in US policy or international governmental and legal institutions, even the Nobel Prize, suggests that these dynamics are in no way external to the ways the agenda works. They may even be integral to whatever success this feminist agenda has had, and that's what we mean by the cunning of gender violence. And in using this term, it's a little bit derivative. We are following the analytical leads of Elizabeth Povinelli, whose Cunning of Recognition focuses on the double binds imposed on Indigenous Australians by the apparently benign liberal multicultural policies of recognition, and Nancy Fraser, who used the cunning of history to call out the dovetailing and sometimes active collusion of second wave white feminist demands with the emerging agendas of neoliberal capitalism. So the book traces the workings of GB Vow in 3 circuits of power. That's the way we came to think of it: security or securitization, state power, and humanitarianism, and its older cousin, developmentalism. Even though actually none of the papers we include were written with this structure in mind. We were thinking when we started only about the way gender violence was being discursively framed in an international sphere, but we came to the realization of what we actually had uncovered collectively rather late in the project in terms of these circuits of power. So I'm going to go ahead, jump ahead, and just read you a bit from the conclusion, which we titled Feminist Conundrums. The reasons for the success, productivity, visibility, and wide public embrace in popular culture and international policy of the GB Vow agenda are complex and, as this book argues, troubling. There's plenty of criticism from within about the agenda's apparent failure to deliver an end to gender violence, despite flashy rituals promoted by UN Women, like the annual 16 Days Against Violence, and not insignificant funding and participation of feminists in forums, organizations, policy initiatives, and activities from local grassroots women's organizations in Kenya and Pakistan up to the UN Security Council and the Counterterrorism Forum. There's no question that feminist activists have worked hard, and I think in good faith, for the goals of addressing and condemning gender violence. And much of the praxis-focused feminist literature bemoans the fact that these efforts have not had the intended or desired impacts. The mainstreaming of GB Vow has been especially disappointing to those who lament the watering down of feminist aspirations and emancipatory visions as compromises have had to be made to get traction for fighting the scourge of widespread gender violence, from domestic abuse to rape and war. Janet Halley, in her ambivalent analysis of the emergence of what she calls governance feminism, defined as the varieties of feminism and feminists who entered into or worked with institutions of power, national or international, has identified what she calls the 5 C's that alignment with power risk: collaboration, compromise, collusion, complicity, and co-optation. Others charged that the feminist agenda was hijacked or puzzle over the existence of strange bedfellows, a term that I actually used in Do Muslim Women Need Saving as well. The attempts by those driven by concerns about gender justice or peace to appropriate openings, whether through human rights, as Fionnuala Niolan is doing as the first feminist legal scholar appointed special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and freedoms while countering terrorism, or in terms of inclusion, like the proliferating NGOs and civil society organizations incentivized by donors to adapt their work to include counterterrorism or countering violent extremism, which is the subject of my own contribution to this book, in the emergence of what I call securofeminism. They've been characterized as confronting Hobson's choice between inclusion with compromise or exclusion, and thus sacrificing any ability to influence decisions or policies. And we see this more as a Faustian bargain. Our studies of the dynamics of gender violence and the workings of the GB Vow apparatus on the ground, not just in security, but in state violence, developmentalism, and humanitarianism, suggests that the choice between inclusion for influence and exclusion for inability to act is false. The pleas for inclusion and mainstreaming of gender into the workings of hegemonic power politics are for us part of the problem. Inadequate attention to gender or the absence of women from what even these groups characterize as the masculine world of security and state power is a minor problem compared to what our essays reveal about the effects of GB vows, imbrication with major circuits of power, on the capacity to identify and to call out the specific modes and causes of so many forms of violence that poison lives and suppress possibilities. The dynamics of ethnic, racial, religious, and civilizational otherizing that our various close studies reveal are integral to the forms and circuits of power that define the contemporary world order. Transnational feminist projects around gender violence are therefore implicated. Securitization around counterterrorism and armed conflicts, repressive states and regimes that in unregulated ways inflict or incite gendered violence to suppress their own populations, often their minorities, and the hidden violences of bureaucratized humanitarianism shared with neoliberal developmentalism in the rhetorics of helping, rescuing, or empowering are precisely the matrices of power in which GB Vow has flourished. What has the narrow and flat definition of what constitutes gender violence as object of knowledge, as intervention? What has it kept out of the frame? Who's benefiting from the apparatus and who's being harmed? We share concerns like those of Karen Engel, who had this to say about the obsessive grip that sexual violence has gained over the women, peace, and security agenda. And she wrote in her new book, when human rights became the primary avenue for feminist interventions in the new conflicts, their focus on ending the abuse of women in war, rather than on ending war itself, sidelined or transformed the women's peace advocates and their aims. Our sensitivity to broader issues like these emerges both from our theoretical, political orientations and the locations of our commitments to the everyday lives of the subjects of violence who appear to be the objects of feminist intervention. These are people at the margins. We're suspicious of versions of Western liberal and radical feminism that have a singular focus on women and gender, although we're all driven by our absolute concerns for those marked by gender, which is all of us. We're attentive to governance as both biopolitical and necropolitical, as your previous guest taught us, rather than a matter of law and policy. And we find compelling the broader analysis of a largely eclipsed tradition of transnational feminism from the global South that has always been anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and committed to wider struggles for social and economic justice. Our primary locations in critical scholarly rather than policy worlds, perhaps, along with our alignments with world regions that have been targeted for intense militarization, securitization, policing, surveillance, and violent management, have made us wary of requesting inclusion. Outside the moss of governance structures, the social science and legal frameworks that support them, and the economic precarity that makes Hobson's choice so intense for some of our feminist activist counterparts, we've chosen the margins as our center, committed to or coming from these global margins. We've listened closely to those in harm's way, looking with them at the multitudes of unfolding violences that affect their lives. The cunning of GB Vow for us is that it seems to foreclose a radical questioning of the very systems of power that are producing the conditions for so many forms of gendered violence and harm, many never even named as such. So the Cunning of Gender Violence suggests that we need to ask hard questions about when, how, and why GB vow, while a form of capital for some, has been disempowering for others, whether local women's activist groups or the most vulnerable subjects of violence, like refugees, many others. Hallie and her colleagues call this a distributional analysis. We're not quite sure what that means, but it sounds right. How is harm and gain distributed? We show how the Cunning of GB Vow operates on feminist scholars and international activists, as well as on local activists. So acknowledging the genuine concerns and critical internal debates within feminist communities, the question that an intervention like ours inevitably provokes is what alternatives could there be? How can we take gender violence, small g, small v, seriously, as real, disturbing, abhorrent, while challenging the feminist apparatus that has been developed over the past couple of decades to address it? Can the dense networks of power be disrupted and undone as we hold firm to the ethical responsibility to respond to violence? A first step is to map this cunning across different contexts. If securitization, state violence, corporate developmentalism, and humanitarianism are all recognized as in themselves violent, then we must attend to how they're gendered and what GB Vow does and does not do when it attaches itself to them. This we've done by tracking GB Vow in specific institutions. But because of who we are, the kind of people we thought to bring together for this project, we've looked to the everyday experiences of the subjects of violence, their cultural representations, and the vocabularies deployed to justify violence against them. And we think the best clues come from close listening. Their everyday stories and their analyses offer alternatives to the ossified and simplified categories and definitions of GB Vow that circulate through and across policy domains, reports, and funding proposals. Untangling the multiple, entwined, and layered forms of violence that devastate their lives, physical, social, and psychic, helps us resist the selectivity of the violences made visible, the willed blindness to collateral harms, and the suspension of judgment about the complex political interests at stake in the worlds we inhabit, or the world we inhabit. Maybe it's one world. So we end our introduction with the following sentence. We fail the subjects we care most about if we let feminist anti-violence projects get caught up in and then inadvertently shore up apparatuses of rule that are inimical to the political convictions and wider visions of justice that feminisms, at their best, seek to embody. So thanks for this chance to share an overview of what we've done collectively, and I look forward to our conversations and your questions. And I wish my buddies were here with me to share in that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lila. I will now invite Soraya to pose the first question from our panel.
Hi there, everyone. Hi, Lila. Thank you again for this. I have to say, not to be cheesy, but thank you for your powerful work. Your work is the work that keeps on giving, right? So the imprint that it has had in my own work has just been, yeah, it has its place. So thank you. The question I have to do is in large part related to the article that you wrote on secure feminism. And I wondered if we could speak more precisely about that. In your essay, you mention a group from the Global South by the name of Women's Alliance for Security Leadership. And you quote what they claim to be their 3-decade warning from women's rights groups against the rise of extremism around the globe. And then you write, it used to be called fundamentalism. I'm wondering, however, if these two terms of fundamentalism and extremism have actually been used by feminist groups to mean different things, or by extension, when other secure feminists, as you call them, have used these terms, they've done so with certain differences in mind and how they varyingly promote misogyny. and the erasure of women's rights. For instance, the former, fundamentalism, seems more aligned with forms of fundamentalism stemming from political movements of the extreme right that manipulate religion, chiefly culture or ethnicity, whereas the latter term, extremism, has been used by many UN-aligned women's groups to mean discriminatory movements not drawing from religion, for instance, the ethno-nationalists. I noticed in your particular essay the discussion of feminists who are working in the fields of cultural rights, peace and security, who push back and are extremely careful in defining these terms is scarcely mentioned, nor relevant. And I'm hoping you don't mind commenting on that and by extension answering a more direct question, which is, if the two terms have indeed been conflated and interchanged, does this mean that, CVF, which could be countering violent fundamentalism, and CVE, which is countering violent extremism, have similar profiles and agendas, even when taking into account the post-2001 sort of war on terror period to the post-2012 uprisings in your analysis?
Thank you. Yeah, this is really a great question. And actually one that I hadn't really thought through. I hadn't thought about the differences. That was the kind of throwaway line, what used to be called fundamentalism. But this makes me realize I need to think a little harder about it. The differences between the older discourse on fundamentalism from a few decades ago, as explored by feminists, but in the bigger project that I'm sure you know about, Martin and Scott Appleby's 1990s huge mega project on fundamentalism, and the newer framing in terms of violent extremism, which is ubiquitous in projects linked to security post 9/11 and the war on terror, as you say. And in the case of fundamentalism, I think the religious aspect was front and center. And there was, say, in these big projects on fundamentalism, some attempt to recognize it across different religious communities, like literal or conservative interpretations of scripture to do, terrible things in the world. But lurking always seemed to me was the special bogeyman of Islamic fundamentalism, and probably inspired, I don't actually work on this, but by what you work on, Islamic Republic of Iran and the Iranian Revolution. I think somehow they're linked together. And early feminist organizations that I became aware of, like Women Living Under Muslim Law, worked with the term, if I'm not mistaken, and they feared the way that conservative Islamic groups and regimes were using Muslim law to deprive women of rights. And I think the landscape has changed dramatically since the days when people worried about fundamentalism. Although I think Janet Jacobson in our book talks about that nexus, but especially with the emergence, the world has actually changed with the emergence over the past couple of decades of movements of Islamic feminism, and even reevaluations of the meanings of women's political participation in Islamist organizations. I mean, how do we deal with that if it's so bad for women? So we think in different ways, but what's interested me in this new phase, as these women's groups, women's rights groups from the global South, I mean, they're part of the international world, but global South, like the Women's Alliance for Security, what was it called? WASL, because it's, also means something like reaching connection, as they retool to gain funding for their work that was always important on the ground, but now they need the money from counterterrorism sources. And they're trying to mainstream gender into the big business of countering extremism. Is what's happened is that they've shifted their vocabulary to embrace this new term, violent extremism. And you read my essay, I call it a phantom. Extremism is worse than fundamentalism because it seems to be detached even from religious ideals. And thus it has no respectable logic at all. I mean, at least you can think, well, people have their faith and think God should make us do this, but extremists have no moral no morality, no reason for what they're doing. They're just extreme. And though you're right, I think the latter part of your question is really interesting. The two terms, both terms of opprobrium, emerge from the liberal ideal of moderation. You shouldn't be fundamentalist about your religion, you shouldn't be extreme. But fundamentalism named an excess of religion, or a conservative interpretation of it, but extremism just names something bad, generally linked to violence. And our colleague Nadia Fadel and her co-authors working on radicalization in Europe, and this is the presumed ideological groundwork for producing violent extremism, she says that radicalization is an empty signifier. And I say the same about extremism. It appears like fundamentalism, and then what's interesting to think about the two together, it appears like fundamentalism not to discriminate against particular religions, but like that term, I think everywhere in the policy documents and reports I've read, it is mainly applied to Muslims, just as fundamentalism. I mean, yeah, there were some Christian fundamentalists, but the real problem was probably the Iranian Revolution. I'm not sure, but you can correct me. So then, and actually Trump is really interesting. May he long be gone. He actually wanted to come out in the open. And he didn't like the term violent extremism, which Obama stuck with. And he wanted to call it Islamic violent extremism. Let's just be open about it. But the irony, as you're pointing out, is that after, and you said it was 2012, but I think you meant 2021, right? I assume. The irony, as you point out, is that after what we witnessed in Charlottesville and Washington, D.C. by Trump's white supremacist violent extremist supporters, the term has actually become more ecumenical, but I still object to it as a term. I don't think feminists or anyone should use it. It's like terrorism. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And we have to have more concrete, more complex analyses of what's going on. What are those labeled extremists fighting for? What's their analysis of the political situation in which they would resort to violence? Why do only states and national and international security apparatuses have the legitimate right to use violence? And in our book, Nadra argues for this concept of state criminality. Why are states and regimes friendly to the powerful states exempted from being recognized as perpetrators of gender-based violence? Why is it just non-state actors? Why is it just these rogues? What's gained by refusing to ask about the contexts in which non-state groups or even individuals resort to violence? It's a deliberately dehistoricizing label. Fundamentalism might be too, but this one's like, there's not even, there's not even something good at its heart, like religion, that could be interpreted well or badly. It's just off the charts. It's deliberately dehistoricizing. It creates groups as monstrous, irrational, instead of looking closely at the histories, including the histories of the creation of these groups. And, you think about the Daesh and the birth of Daesh in the jails of occupied Iraq. There's a history to these things. There's something that produced them. Or you need to look at their day-to-day conditions of occupation, dispossession, prison torture, militarized control, as in so many places, from Kashmir to Palestine, or even discrimination and hate crimes, as in Europe, which Sandra tells us a lot about. We need to ask about the dynamics of geopolitical violence and how these inform the extremists' understanding of themselves and the world and what they can do. And the same might even be said about those who some like to call extremists, who people are now calling, saying they rioted in the Capitol, right? It was an insurrection, but now it's become a riot, to dismiss it as any kind of political gesture. How about talking about class? the disastrous economics for the working class, talk about long-sanctioned history of racism in the US, from settler colonialism to slavery. Let's talk about financial and political support for ideologies like theirs that make it seem right and just that they should be doing this, including those who fan Islamophobia and fear of others for the last couple of decades. Let's talk about anti-immigration policies. These are needed to understand patriarchal white supremacist extremism. These are matters that Sindre has written about so well for Norway and Europe. We can't just label people extremist. There's a history and politics, a vocabulary to be teased out here. And I think it's different. You know, fundamentalism worked in a different way and had slightly different object. And I think the extremist language has sort of taken over, and it's not maybe accidental. We'd have to think more about it, but I really appreciate your bringing this up, because for me that was a throwaway, you know, it was like a parenthetical statement that actually I think I need to go back and think a little harder about. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before you now go overboard with trying to flatter the panelists, Lila, I immediately give the microphone to Srilata and her question.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Sindre. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. I'm really glad that my first venture with this collective has been to engage with the texts that you have so generously shared with us, Lila. I've greatly enjoyed engaging with them, and they're really fascinating. And there are two aspects of your intervention, your and your co-authors' interventions, that really stand out to me as relevant both to my work, but also generally to the project of, feminist theorization. So one is the relationship between feminist politics and religion, and the other is the relationship between feminist politics and institutionalized power. And many of the claims and findings that you posit in your own chapter, as well as the co-authored introduction, have sort of been there, on the horizon of feminist consciousness for a while, but I think they come together very sharply in this vocabulary of secure feminism and the cunning of gender-based violence. So thank you for that. And that then also leads to this feminist conundrum that you've mentioned. So I want to kind of complicate that conundrum a bit further by bringing in another, marginal position within feminist theorization, which is anti-caste feminism, and sort of try to put that in conversation with what you have been discussing so far, and then go on to asking the question that I want to ask. And for the benefit of the audience, I just want to lay out some of the key claims of anti-caste feminism. So one of the key claims is that caste and gender are mutually reinforcing, mutually sustaining systems of power and control. And the source of gender-based sexual violence and caste violence is located in anti-caste feminist perspectives in what is referred to as Brahmanical patriarchy, making the connection between religion and patriarchy, and by extension nation and nationhood and statehood, very, very clear. And so the rejection of patriarchy from an anti-caste perspective cannot take place without the rejection of Brahmanism. And there can be no such thing as a moderate Brahmanical position. And so that then leads us to the question of, is it possible to have solidarity between different streams of feminist critique and feminist politics? And what would that solidarity look like? Because unlike secure feminists, anti-caste feminists are extremely critical of state crimes, as you've called them. But somewhat like secure feminists, they are in fact aspiring to institutionalized power, especially in the context of increasingly influential Hindu nationalism, not just in South Asia, but across the globe. And the other claim is also that the anti-caste framing is not just relevant to South Asia or what is referred to as Hindu society, but to South Asian society at large, but also globally, increasingly relevant. So having laid that background out, my specific question is, how would future feminist solidarities look on the question of religion and on the question of institutionalized power? And can there be, or should there be, a unified, certainly not universal, but a unified feminist stance towards these questions that can bypass the carceral state and still have discursive influence in society?
Brilliant question. And a whole lesson in anti-caste feminism at the same time. Thank you so much. I can't do justice to your question, but I'm really glad you raised all of that, Shilata. And you surely know more than I do about this, but let me try a little bit. I've actually been very interested in the anti-caste feminists and their analysis of Brahminical patriarchy. And we had an amazing panel at Columbia organized by my dear colleague Anu Rao. That just blew my mind. And I collected all the posters and have them in my office from some of these groups. Smash Brahminical patriarchy, very sharp and interesting analysis for me, who was, of course, trained as an anthropologist, Dumont, of course. So we're throwing that all out. Anyway, but I think there's a lot to learn from thinking about this crucial movement in terms of solidarities, just as the Indian case has thrown up thorny questions for feminists outside and within India because of the minority problem of Muslim women, which is one I work a little more closely on, and the contentious politics. Are you based in India now?
Not at the moment. I'm now based in London, but yeah,
in London,
lived
right.
most of my life in India.
Yeah. The contentious politics of feminism were front and center for me when I had the privilege of visiting Delhi to give some lectures a little more than a year ago, pre-COVID. And internal debates that I didn't know enough about actually exploded in the lecture rooms as I was being recruited by Muslim and Dalit women for their sides against the other feminists. I mean, I hardly knew how to handle it in terms of, where do I situate myself? That wasn't what I was saying. That's not what I meant. But there was obviously a lot going on and, people standing up and, declaring. So I learned two lessons. I was intrigued by the solidarities being forged by anti-caste feminists, the ones that I met based in the US with Black feminists, with race being the central signifier. But you brought up something that simply can't be set aside, the imbrication of patriarchy with religion. And caste is not race, though it is racist. So that's very interesting. And I think the specifics are crucial. And I'm glad you sort of even spelled out a bit more what that is. And this is even more apparent in the case of violence against Muslims in India and the whole framing of issues in terms of communities, which has always intrigued me. I often co-teach with South Asianists, and I say, we never use the word communities in Middle East studies. What is this thing, communities? So that, you have to think about that. But in that case, the feminists have long been divided about alliances. Accusations fly somewhat. I'd love to hear more and learn more from you about this, somewhat unfairly, even if true that the Indian feminist community is upper caste and upper class Hindu. Yes, objectively, mostly true, but what's their position? What are their alliances? They should be judged by their politics. And I might even translate this, which comes back to your question, which I won't be able to answer about institutions. I translate this into Halley's terms of governance feminists, trying to work through means of law perceived as secular and universal, UCC issues, rather than the way it was framed in the discussions as a question of identity politics. It's who you are. It's like what your position is. What's your analysis? Where do you think politics lie? And I think that, I don't know, this is so big. The specifics of the situation really matter always to me. And what I always worry about are universalizing moves that flatten differences, pick up one kind of oppression and forget the others. And I want to understand, and I think it's absolutely crucial to understand how Dalits and Muslims are differently situated within the Indian polity and everyday life, and how the histories of the political struggles of these groups affect the current gender politics within the communities and in relation to the state and elites and the possibility of alliances. And in our book, we actually haven't quite taken this on. Nobody did, but we only have one essay on India. In our book, Interpol, Gruel has contributed a really disturbing essay that both praises certain alliances that were apparent in the Shaheen Bagh demonstrations, as I understand it, which was after I left, and deplores and analyzes social media circulations of what she calls lynchings, borrowing from the American history, lynchings of young Muslim men, reminding us, of course, that gender violence is not just against women. And what we brought out from her analysis in our introduction, which you did read, is how she exposes the state's and BJP's complicity in encouraging this violence through incitement of communal identities. And of course, the total failure to ever investigate any of these crimes. So here, religion is indeed one aspect of the situation, but her analysis points us to the authoritarianism of the Hindu nationalist regime and the politics and economics of the state, not something called Brahminical patriarchy. So like white supremacy, I'm worried about a term like that. It's powerful, but is it useful in analyzing exactly what's at stake and what's going on and how we might actually do something about it? And anti-caste activism has been going on for a long time. And my friend Anu's finishing her book on Ambedkar, and I should know more about it, but we know that. So, but the gendering of it has been a really important step, I think, for feminists there. But for me, terms like this, so I can't tell you what they should do. Work with the state, not work with the state. But I can say that terms like this, sort of the way I answered Soraya's question, don't, for me, adequately explain the intersecting and layered structures of power, or the ideologies that accompany them, which I think you're very attuned to, even in the way you described it. So then what does that mean for solidarity? Maybe solidarity can't come unless one simplifies, but I'm too much of an anthropologist to think simplicity is a good thing. So solidarity has to, as you put it, I think, perhaps unite while having at base a recognition of very real differences in the situations of those who are fighting injustice, which may always be gendered, but they're fighting it in different ways. But that is a conundrum, absolutely, even worse than the one we're trying to deal with. But thank you for raising it.
Thank you. Thank you for your response.
So Lila, I had two questions here, and starting with your chapter in the forthcoming co-edited volume, The Cunning of Gender Violence. Your chapter herein is entitled The Phantom of Extremism. And herein you introduce the figure of the secure feminist, right? And those familiar with the work of, say, Sarah Faris on femonationalism, or even Just pour Pouvoir on homonationalism, would recognize some affinities with their terminology. But part of your argument herein is that female and feminist inclusion in the global countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism industry involves a Faustian bargain, in which the centrality of the Muslim question, including the very idea that Muslim men in particular pose the preeminent threat both to national security and women's rights across the globe, and the inclusion of state violence against women, have to be accepted at face value by all feminists who choose to involve themselves in this very industry. But can you tell us more about who exactly these securo feminists are and the kind of work that they do, so that we get a more concrete picture? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you have to read the book, but where do I begin? Maybe let's just talk about how I got interested in what I came to call secure feminists. And I got interested in it, obviously, through my work on Islamophobia, the work that you and I have shared on the fear of the Muslim man and all of that. And you alerted me, actually, pretty early on to the way feminists promoting human rights had allied with anti-immigrant policymakers and the Eurabia ideologues. But I didn't know much about CVE or PVE until a young graduate of our School of Public and International Affairs kept getting in touch with me and asking me for an appointment because she really, really wanted to get my advice. And because I saw her name was, Pakistani, I agreed to meet with her. Okay, let's see what I can do, even though she hadn't been my student and I didn't think I would be able to help her. But it turned out that she worked for an NGO that worked on girls' leadership in places in the global south, something that Dina Siddiqui and Shanila Khoja Mulji, two of the contributors to our project, had already alerted me to as problematic. The most dramatic example being Nike's sponsorship of the Girl Effect and so forth. But anyway, she wanted to know if I could help her make a case that girls' leadership was essential for CVE. And she was desperate because the only big funding being offered at the UN was from the United Arab Emirates, and it was for CVE, and they were in town, and they wanted to, her NGO needed, it was going to fold if they couldn't get some funding. So I was so ignorant, I said, what's CVE? I had no idea what the initials stood for. And then when she said countering violent extremism, I just immediately said, stay away from this. But I had no idea why. I didn't know what it was. And that's what got me into this whole crazy world that I investigated for what ended up being this paper. It was a lot bigger than the paper ended up. And I immediately found brilliant work exposing the dangerous politics of surveillance and stigmatization of Muslims through CVE and PVE, through people like Aaron Kunai. But I was interested in the feminist angle and the gender angle, which he hadn't touched on. And that led me to start reading policy reports, human rights reports, the whole world of women activists, human rights workers, longtime feminists arguing for a place at the counterterrorism table at the US Institute of Peace. I just Googled and found. And I was really shocked. And there were all these calls for mainstreaming gender into counterterrorism and security. There were calls for inclusive security. That's the way some of the terms that were used. And I was really shocked to find so much of this. And what struck me was that they promoted their special expertise and the special work they would do for CVE by pointing, this one wanted to link it to girls' leadership because that's what they had to get funded. But they linked it often to specific gender violences of the so-called extremists. I found a whole cottage industry that emerged. Later, I found this whole cottage industry that emerged around the puzzle that women returning from Syria and Iraq who had gone to join Daesh confronted them with. Since the men were so bad and they were so violent, why were the women actually going to join them? Something's confusing here. So then there's a whole cottage industry, and King's College is a great producer of documents around this question, some of your colleagues. It was just a whole world, which I didn't know anything about before. And it took me a long time, and I'm still actually changing I was very crude at the beginning about it, and maybe I would write it a little differently now, but so I don't have time to go into the quasi academic studies or these cookie cutter policy briefs that I started drowning in, for an anthropologist who gets to work on poetry and things like that. Well, to read these things was killer. But to come back to your question, I came to name all of those different groups. There's Wassel, but then there are lots of other different kinds of groups. All those who didn't fundamentally challenged the basic category, violent extremism. I called them all securo-feminisms, securo-feminists. I later discovered Interpol Gruel's term of security feminists, but those are kind of the official ones, the West Point, the people in this security establishment, but these weren't. These were the feminists outside it, but they didn't challenge the basic category, meaning, and even those who worked critically with the term, as I was to discover, many of the women's human rights advocates and legal scholars that I've actually come to respect the more I learn about them, but if they stayed within the terms set by the security definition of the world or security definition of the situation, I call them securo-feminists, and I'm sure and I have to say, I wrote that, actually basically worked on it a few years ago, and I've got to know more of these people recently, which makes me a little uncomfortable. I got more and more uncomfortable the more I came to know the actually intelligent, moral, well-meaning feminist activists and legal scholars, especially, who are working to shift things to get gender harm noticed and to get women's and girls' rights considered by what they rightly say is a masculine security establishment. And I've come to see the nuances a bit more than I did when I first encountered the whole field. And even as I was revising the paper, I realized some were I was confusing some security feminists with securo-feminists. And I've come to suspect that many of them might be using this concern for women and girls as actually a ruse to expose the violence of security, of policing, of militarization, of surveillance, of humanitarianism. But I still want to stick to the margins of this feminism that won't refuse point blank the terms that are set for them and this vocabulary of violent extremism. I don't think, can you challenge the whole enterprise if you don't challenge the concept that's at the center? Can you challenge, maybe back to Srilata's question, can you challenge from within the institutions of power? And I'm just not sure, but it's sort of ongoing because lately a whole group of them have been very generous and let me sit in on seminars and consultations, and you realize they're very many are very serious and interesting people, but I don't think you can do it from within if you accept the term violent extremism, CV, PV, counterterrorism. The whole thing defines the situation in a way that already lays the ground, it already sets the limits of the possibilities. So that's how I got into it, though.
Thank you very much, Lila. My last question before we open the floor for the Q&A. In your co-authored introduction to the Cunning of Gender Violence, you and your co-editors argue in favor of choosing the margins as our center. So in the very context in which we're speaking now, this is, of course, of great interest to us. You advance the case for a return to the largely eclipsed, this is a quote, the largely eclipsed tradition of transnational feminism from the global south that has always been anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and committed to wider struggles for social and economic justice. But what would this return to origins in our time actually entail? What are these traditions?
Thanks. Really, really important question, which in a way echoes Srilata's question about solidarity, but from another angle. And what did we mean by saying we were choosing the margins as our center? It was precisely that we wanted to stand at the margins of mainstream, rights-based or human rights-based feminist theorizing, at the margins of governance feminism, Hallie's term, that works within the institutions of power, and at the margins of Western power and interests. But actually, I do think the three of us, that's why I said we couldn't tell whose sentences were whose and whose thoughts were whose, because we work so closely together. But I do think the three of us, Nedra and Rima and I, think very differently about many things, but about transnational feminism, about feminism from the global South, and about its histories. And we have different levels of knowledge about it. Nedra, I think, has been much more involved as an activist in global South feminist networks than I have. You know, she's on all the lists. She goes to all the meetings. You know, she knows everybody. Rima has been much more involved within the Palestinian women's movement and its various phases and state building and now disaster than I have. And she teaches regularly about the global North-South debates about priorities. She talks about decades on women and women, peace and security. I mean, I knew nothing about that before I joined this group. I don't even quite know what transnational feminism is, but we wrote the sentence. As an anthropologist, I've always been interested in gender dynamics, as you know, but I always wanted to understand how the women and girls I was living with thought about these things. And so I came a bit late, a bit cautiously into the territory of something that could be called feminism and even feminist theory, because it seems so distant from the worlds of the communities that I lived with in Egypt. Because I was in rural areas, these things hadn't, I still have an ambivalent relationship to feminism per se, as a project specifically about promoting women's and girls' rights. And you could tell that, I think, from my answer to Srilata. I've learned from those involved in our project over these past years even more reasons to be ambivalent, precisely because of the kind of success feminism has had. But what you're really right to point it out, and this is going to be, you're going to see a difference in the introduction when we rewrite it for publication. You're right that we can't ever go back to anything. We can't go back to anything. The world has moved so dramatically, both within human rights taking over the political sphere, certain kinds of feminisms having made tremendous inroads, especially in international institutions. And think of McKinnon and carceral feminism and the ICC and all of that, and even neoliberalism, making certain kinds of common cause impossible, although maybe other ones possible. So thanks to this question, I think we will definitely revisit this set of sentences that I remember we sort of dashed out the conclusion. We were like really racing to finish, to finally get it off. But what I think we used this transnational feminism of the global South to gesture towards was the strong clash in the 70s, 80s, really, a little bit beyond, between those who push just for women's and girls' rights or even sexual rights, and those who talked about economic and social rights. And I think we're hoping to signal a more radical and expansive look at power, at global inequalities, slow violence, structural violence, colonial violence, of course, and social justice. You know, what is causing harm to people? Much of it is gendered, and Srilata's right to kind of, it's like so tightly gendered. Much is gendered in different ways in different places. And I know there's something that could vaguely be called patriarchy, but I never use the term because it's just too blunt, too crude a category or a concept for me. And I don't see what's gained by lumping all the different harms under something called feminism. And I remember really being stopped in my tracks when I started reading Janet Halley, and the first article, I don't know if it was about rape and war, and she asked this question about rape and war, and she said, is a woman being raped in war really worse than a man being killed in war? what kind of calculus are we using? So let's think about war. Let's think about that kind of violence, which harms everybody. Yes, there's specific things that happen to women and they happen to men, but what's the big picture? So I think that's what we were trying to, gesture towards in this return to transnational feminism from the global South. And this was a kind of shorthand, but I think you're making me think that this is not quite the right concept or the idea of going back. But we wanted to sort of situate ourselves and what we had done through our essays. And I think we did a few things, but first, so from the global South was, we wanted to describe what we think distinguishes most of our essays, which is the kind of depth of knowledge and intimate connection, if not identification, with the places that we write about in this project. And the violences that we're trying to understand, how they affect people. Not mine on Secure Feminists, but I do care about the effects on Muslim communities of the promotion of this concept of extremism. But the others are much more ethnographic, much more anthropological, or ethnographic, let's put it that way. I think it's important that we have an Iranian trans scholar activist writing about LGBTQI asylum seekers begging the UNHRC for help, willing to play the game of saying that their sex reassignment surgery was torture in Iran, and not to say that they had to leave Iran because US sanctions were making life unlivable. It makes a difference that they know this, that we have a Bangladeshi feminist scholar writing about, all double consciousness scholars working, in the academy. So it's not a native thing, but a connection to the place. They're writing about a deep knowledge of language and nuance and histories. We have a Bangladeshi feminist scholar writing about women's organizations that are bending to the obsession with the worldwide scandal of child marriage, just as she'd looked behind the scenes in earlier work with us about legal arguments about the scandal of women marrying their rapists, where she discovered the ways this accusation actually hid socially unacceptable consensual sexuality for young women. It makes a difference that she could go behind the scenes, that she could look at the legal documents, that she could talk to people. That we have a Palestinian and occupied East Jerusalem walking girls to school in the morning to spare them some of the harassment and violation that they endure, and even watching some being shot. This makes a difference. Where are our loyalties? How well do we understand that these are complex landscapes, socially, culturally, politically, historically, and that they matter? They matter to us. So that, I think that transnational feminism from the global South is supposed to hint at this commitment to the places and the knowledge of the places. But there's also the broader ideal that maybe where we need to think more, the broader ideal that we wanted this term to signify, though we can't go back to anti-imperial, anti-colonial, even Marxist politics, I guess, although I do read Vijay Prasad's newsletters, the new revived tricontinental, who makes me happy. But in my own essay, I try to lay out quickly the alternatives to secure feminism and the problem with the term extremism. And maybe this is helpful as a way to think about this. What I say is, let's think about extremism. Many consider any resort to violence extreme. Pacifists, feminists, critics of war, those working against the patriarchal norms of masculinity and male dominance in politics have long organized against violence, both in the home and the prison and in the international sphere. State terror, state criminality are terms that almost never appear in the secure feminist literature. You could ask whether the extreme violence of shock and awe, for us based in the US and Britain, you feel terrible. Is the extreme violence of shock and awe carried out by powerful armies, bombers, drones, proxy militias? Shouldn't that should that be excluded from extremism? Their effects on people and communities are catastrophic, I say. So then, is it only violence perpetrated by groups on the ever-growing US terror list that qualifies as extremist? Right, so, you know, let's think about the big picture. And I also said in that paper, excuse me for quoting myself, but, you know, I'd rather quote than say something incoherent. Proposals for protecting women from extremist violence through PVE and CVE rarely introduce recommendations that security states from US to Israel, France, Russia, India, China should change course, or that conflict should be resolved. The recommendations from the soft security sphere do not include pursuing political solutions rather than military ones, banning global arms production and sales. What a great idea that would be. Halting support for violent allies or proxies, violently repressing their own citizens, or seeking radical ways to limit massive destruction, injury, deprivation, and death. Questioning the capitalist imperative that entrenches gross global inequality outside the frame. Secure feminist engagements with CVE rarely challenge priorities in the allocation of global resources. And I think of the Costs of War project at the Watson Institute at Brown University that Catherine Lutz established. They calculate the costs of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, not just in weapons and death tolls, but in alternative ways such funds could have been spent on education, health, and welfare. These are all core feminist issues. So colonial partitions, political machinations, power politics, competing interests, resource exploitation, irreversible trains of action-reaction that are set in motion, all of this is erased by talk about extremism and its women casualties. So, you know, it's the localization of the knowledge and commitment to the communities that are the subjects of violence, and the big picture of like, where is all this harm coming from, that we're trying to reuse that shorthand to indicate, but I think it's not enough. But I ended my chapter saying, you know, that the gendered lens of feminism is crucial, but it needs to be wide-angled, not trained only on subjects predefined by others and rife with obfuscating undefined terms. And feminist politics have always been contentious. Maybe we need to find a better way to think about the grounds for future political work in these new political, economic, and social circumstances of what you're, you know, saying. It's a new world order. And the transnational feminists of the global South in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they couldn't have even dreamed that we would be living in the world that we're living out. Back to Soraya's question of the war on terror, neoliberalism, all of this was not the world we lived in, the end of the Cold War. So you're right, we can't go back. But that's what we were trying to say in a nutshell, you know, to gesture towards this other way of analyzing things. But I think maybe we need to articulate that better, to actually spell out what we think is possible, what we might want, and of course, always the question, who are we? Thanks.
So I think that's the first theory from the margins that we have become part of the editing process of a book.
Okay, right. Well, that's you always have the finished books. Luckily, we were so far behind. I was hoping the book would be out by the time I was on here, but no.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So we're approaching the end here, but I think we have space for 3 questions, right, Budi? Before we round off, right?
Yeah.
And I'm very sorry to all of those for the questions we're not able to pose given the time constraints.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this. This is really enlightening. I had a bunch of questions of my own, but as moderator, we would kind of now prioritize the audience questions, the few we have. However, I wanted to raise one short point about the kind of questions I have selected, because a lot of what Theory from the Margins tries to do is that it creates a platform for Global South scholars as well to kind of reach out and to take part in these discussions. So so the first questions that I've selected several of them, clubbed them together because these are like one-line questions. I thought it would be good to hear your thoughts on some of this. So first question is actually quite simple, which is, please tell me when the book will be out for us to buy and read. That's the first one. And then the second one, which I have clubbed in this, is that I'd be curious to hear more about your thoughts on collaborative writing as a methodology from/off the margins. And third, do you have any good advice for young anthropologists? Thank you for your knowledge.
Well, you're hitting me with friendly questions, aren't you? We have no idea when the book will be out. We did finish it. We sent it off for review to a press. So it all depends. Hopefully they're listening, the people who are reviewing this manuscript, and will realize that we want to get it. We want your comments back as soon as possible so we can keep working on it. So we don't know. But what do you say? 1 year, 2 years, unfortunately, given book publishing. Collaborative writing, what a lovely question, because it's an amazing process, but also frustrating because, especially because we live in different places. And so, you send a version, get back things, waiting for the other person to write like, this is your area of expertise, you write up this part, and that takes a while because other things are happening. But yeah, it takes a lot longer. I often think I would have finished the introduction like a year or two earlier if I'd just written it myself, but it wouldn't have been the same thing because I learned so much from, the back and forth and, the transnational feminists from the Global South. That's not a term I would normally have much to say about, but it came from them. Then we had to think about it. What does it mean? And so forth. So it's very rich, but it's it takes a lot of time, but the whole project itself was collaborative, which is wonderful. You just learn so much. I didn't know anything about most of the things that people wrote their essays about, and yet I had to edit their essays and understand them and give them comments and go back and forth and workshop them. So I have this, I'm a much expanded person because of the collaborative effort. And I think it's important. It's really been very rewarding for me. I'm actually, the next essay I think I'm going to write, I have to give a lecture, and I thought, it was supposed to be for anthropology and ethnography, and like, that'll get us to the next question. I don't know what I have to say. I haven't done ethnography for a long time. The Secure Feminism was not based on ethnography because I couldn't imagine doing ethnography at the UN, things like that. It's going to be about friendship, intellectual friendship, because I think back on how I learned anything. It's both friendships in the field and friendships with colleagues over these years. So I think it's a very important thing for us to think about who influences us, and I mentioned Sindra several times. It wasn't flattery. I learned things from you, that actually, or Eurabia, I never heard of it, right? So then I understood what was going on, and then it shaped how I understood other things. So I think that's really important. Advice for young anthropologists, that I'm not sure I can give that. I always give the same advice to all. It's a colonial science. We're very critical of it, but I don't think there's any better way to know something in the world than to give your life and your body and your thoughts and your affections to others to try to enter their world. So they say, oh, what should I do? What's my method? I said, oh, just listen and write everything down and listen and think and be part of it. So I actually still am very loyal to the discipline, despite I've been very critical of it as well in writing, but as a way of knowing intimately, there's nothing like it. So I don't know if that's helpful advice, but do it.
Thank you so much. The reason I selected those questions is simply also because of inspiring ideas. That's ultimately where we also want to go. But I do think we have time for at least one slightly longer question. And I will send you all the audience questions because we have a lot of them later on. But this is from someone in the audience, and she asks, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction to this important work. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, who are the women at the margins that this book is seeking to center? As it was already acknowledged, many women's rights organizations in the Global South participate in the Vogue GBV sector, often bringing strong feminist perspectives, including intersectional structural analysis of violence against women. If their participation in these networks of power implicates them, who is left in the margins? Secondly, what do you hope feminists who are working against Vogue in good faith and see the huge impact their work has on the lives of survivors? What do you think they will take from this book? What do you hope they will do differently? Thank you so much again.
These are statements that could just stand, I think. I don't know that they're questions. I appreciate the pointing out of the intersectional, again, another word I don't actually use very often, but it stands in for something really important, the intersectional analysis of violence, of power, and so forth. Are they implicated? I mean, I've been worried about like who's left, who could review this book, because everybody's implicated and they're going to be mad at us. But I think we recognize, I think what they could do differently, or is say for my, speaking from my part, okay, so the extremism, okay, don't use the term, call it out. Why are we, why does it have to be this term? What is it preventing us from seeing? That could be, even from within, I think some could make a dent, but I'm not so sure. We just had a wonderful book launch of Nimi Gauranathan's new book called Radicalizing Her, about women who use violence and women freedom fighters, Tamil tigers, FARC, and her book, you should all read this one. She includes a lot of, she's somebody who worked in the policy world, as well as being quite radical in, challenging all its terms. And she includes the things I quoted in the book launch were emails that she has gotten from people within the policy world, feminists within the policy world, saying, tone it down. You can't just say white feminists, then nobody will help you. Nobody will work with you. The kind of pressure not to stand at the margins, to actually call out things that she sees, to, look at the state violence and, demobilized women fighters. I mean, it's really kind of an amazing book, but she includes that material. And she sent, after the event, she sent a tweet by a major person who's written about violent women, basically calling her names and saying she's going to remove citations to her in her forthcoming book. So there's a world out there. We worry about it, but I think we recognize the good work, but we also, so what we're trying to do is balance. There's a conundrum. What can we do to move forward? Can we recognize these structures of power within which we're working against something called gender violence? And I think our best, well, not our best, they're all good essays, but the ones that we might learn the most from are for practical moving forward as feminists who really are concerned with these issues, are the analyses of humanitarianism. That's the huge industry, and GBV is the only game in town in humanitarianism, the only thing you can get funding for. There's all the technologies for measuring it. There's all the money that goes into it, all the women's organizations on the ground who work for women, like in Gaza, as Rima points out, they have to somehow make everything they do be about gender violence. There's something wrong there. And I think that they could speak back to that, maybe. That could make a difference. But I don't know if that's a good answer. But I think the question is the right one of, what does it mean to stand at the margins of this kind of feminism when feminists themselves are the margin of power and theory a lot of the time, but we're, yeah. What is it? We worry. I worry. They don't worry. But I think the essays are rich enough and concrete enough that you see how it works, and therefore where you could actually change things or refuse to go along with certain directives from above, and even think about the kind of inclusion that you're seeking. But I don't have answers, and I confess, I think, in there, I always have felt that, I have a privilege as a scholar. I've always said I'm not even an activist, although my scholarship is activist, but I'm not an activist. That's a privileged position. That's not the margins, but it allows me to feel and be able to criticize in certain ways that I think it's very hard. And I recognize the precarity of those who really are working within the system and need to survive to do their good work, but are constrained by it. And maybe that's not the margins. Maybe the scholarly world is not the margins, but we'll see. Anyway.
So thank you very much, Lila. It's time for us to wrap up. You might have noticed from the background image that I keep on my Zoom screen that I'm really doubling as a secret agent of the Norwegian Board of Tourism. But here at Theory from the Margins, we do not get any outside funding, but we do have to make some announcements about coming events in our series. The next event in the Theory from the Margins Zoom webinars is with Professor Paul Gilroy and Professor Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, who will be speaking about their edited volume published with Duke University Press this month, entitled Stuart Hall, Selected Writings on Race and Difference. That will happen on May 13th at exactly the same time, 14:30 UTC +1. So 14:30 is Oslo time. You're also welcome to follow us on our Facebook pages, our web pages at www.theoryfromthemargins.com, or you can also follow us on our YouTube channel at Theory from the Margins, where we will be uploading this Zoom webinar. And you can also find a digital archive of previous events in Theory from the Margins. So I also need to thank my co-panelists, Srilata Shirka, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, and Kristen Soraya Batman Jelici. And last but not least, you, Lila, for taking the time and making the effort and contributing to this wonderful Zoom webinar. There are many of us, not the least within anthropology, who are greatly indebted to all the work you've undertaken over so many years as an anthropologist, and continue to be inspired by the outstanding scholarship that you exemplify. thank you very much.
Thank you.
And welcome back.
Thank you, all of you, and for the questions. And I really look forward to seeing all the audience questions that we didn't get to. The book, luckily, is not published yet, so we can still do something about it, which is the most wonderful time to get any kind of feedback. So thank you for the honor of inviting me and for this amazing conversation. Thanks.